Okay, this is going to be the first of the lectures in regards to World War II. World War II, the actual war time span is from September 1st, 1939 to September 2nd, 1945. But the first series here is going to be looking at the rise of the totalitarian states and looking at the early acts of aggression before the war actually took place. Now, after World War I, just a little recap here of the Treaty of Versailles. We know that Germany had to take full blame for the war. They had to pay war reparations to France and Great Britain. Their army was considerably reduced, their navy, their air force, and they also lost a great deal of colonies overseas. So Germany found themselves in a very difficult economic situation, which did not give them a sense of security. Plus, on top of this, with the fall of Kaiser Wilhelm, the new Weimar Republic was being established within Germany, which was to establish a democratic government. Unfortunately, there wasn't a lot of support in Germany to help establish that democratic government. And as we know with our own country, it took some time to get a democratic government to take hold and to actively start addressing the concerns of the people. Our country, when we tried to implement a democratic government, struggled, for the first couple of years, and then we went to the Constitutional Convention. But these countries in Europe, Germany and parts, former countries like Poland and Czechoslovakia and former countries of Austrian-Hungarian Empire and Ottoman Empire, all these new countries were trying to establish democratic forms of government, but they're also tackling economic depression. They are tackling war destruction in some places, and for many of those new governments, it was just too overwhelming, and so many of the democratic governments failed. And ultimately, this is what is going to lead to the rise of totalitarian regimes throughout many European countries. And so we're going to take a look at now what are some of those totalitarian governments. In a totalitarian regime, this is where the individual is nothing. Your individual wants, your individual voice, your individual needs, those are put to the side. It is everything for the state. And so the authoritative figure who's in control of the state, that they have total control. And this is where the term totalitarian comes in. The first of our established totalitarian dictators is Joseph Stalin, for the Soviet Union. We know that during World War I, Russia left the war early, signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Germany, and lost a considerable amount of land to leave the war early because of the Russian Revolution. The Bolshevik Party started to take rise, and Vladimir Lenin was trying to seize power. But there is going to be a rise of democracy within Russia. And so this is going to create a civil war between the Reds and the Whites. The Reds were the communists, the Whites were the Democrats. This ultimately is going to result in the establishment of the communist state and the formation of the Soviet Union in 1921. And so essentially the Red Army won. Vladimir Lenin is going to pass in 1924, and this is how Joseph Stalin will rise to power. Stalin standing for the term man of steel. And so to establish his totalitarian state, he took complete government control of both the agrarian side of the economy and the industrial side of the economy. So there are no longer any private farms or private industries. Everything is controlled by the government. And he was able to create what he called his collectivized farms, where hundreds of acres were farmed by families. Families were assigned to these collective farms. And if there were any types of opposition, they were eliminated. And so this is going to be at great cost to the Soviet Union. But by 1937, the Soviet Union was the second leading industrial power of the world. They were only surpassed by the United States. But that totalitarian regime, to get to that level, that industrial power that Stalin had a vision for the Soviet Union, it did come at a cost of the people. Anybody who questioned his authority or he deemed a threat to his power, he got rid of. And this was known as the Great Purge. And historians don't know the exact number, but it is estimated that between 8 and 13 million people were killed in Stalin's Great Purge in the Soviet Union, which we'll be talking about the Holocaust in regards to World War II, and 6 million Jews, up to 9 million people were killed in the Holocaust. So it is estimated that more were killed in Joseph Stalin's Great Purge. The next totalitarian leader that we're taking a look at is Benito Mussolini, who came to power in Italy. He wanted to establish a totalitarian regime after World War I because of the rising amount of unemployment and inflation that was taking place within the country. Many people were looking for strong leadership, especially among the middle and the upper class. So Mussolini is going to take advantage of this opportunity. In 1921, he established the Fascist Party, which stressed strong nationalism and placed the interests of the state above individual wants and needs, which of course is the main idea behind a totalitarian regime. In October of 1922, Mussolini had enough power that he marched on Rome with thousands of his followers that got nicknamed Black Shirts because of their black uniforms. And when he had enough government officials and the army and even the police on his side, the king in Italy felt he had no choice. And so he gave power to Mussolini. And Mussolini took the name El Duce, which means the leader. And he began to gradually, not immediately, but gradually started to implement the fascist policies, the totalitarian policies across every aspect of Italian life. And he was able to achieve efficiency. People marveled at how well run Italy was. I mean, down to the trains being on time. And so, of course, the Italian people were very supportive of Mussolini because he did start to bring economic prosperity back to the country. Our next totalitarian leader, as many of you have heard of, is Adolf Hitler and his rise in Germany. Germany, of course, is going to struggle significantly with the reparation payments, the loss of colonies, which means the loss of revenue to help pay for those reparations, and they are also heavily struck down because of the economic Great Depression that's going to hit around the world in the 1930s. And so many German citizens were looking for some form of leadership, and they were not getting that leadership or strength from the Weimar Republic. So Adolf Hitler began his path very similar to Mussolini, and he did prove to be a very good public speaker. He talked to the people. He made promises of bringing back jobs and bringing back economic prosperity to Germany, and he started to get a following. He started to refer to himself as the Führer, or the leader, and so he promised to bring Germany out of this chaos. He is going to write a book called Mein Kampf, which means my struggle. In this book is how Hitler set forth his overall beliefs for Nazism, or for the Nazi Party, which is his own brand of fascism, so extreme nationalism taking place there. Hitler himself wasn't German. Okay, he was born in Austria, but he dreamed of uniting all German-speaking people and land to try to build a greater German empire. And so he hoped to avenge the Treaty of Versailles. Hitler also wanted to enforce racial purification. So he believed that the Aryan race was his master race. And so any inferior races such as Jews, Slavs, or all non-whites were deemed fit only to serve the Aryan race. So they were considered second-class citizens. And so he wanted to expand. He promised to bring back the glory that had been taken away from the Treaty of Versailles. He wanted more living space for his master race, or the Aryan race, to be able to expand and live comfortably. So in January of 1933 is when Hitler will be appointed Chancellor or Prime Minister of Germany. And so he quickly dismantled the German democratic government and created his Third Reich, or the Third German Empire. And this was going to be, a 1,000-year Reich, 1,000 years of prosperity for Germany. And so immediately he starts to implement his policies. Now, one other leader that is going to start to come back to power in the 1930s that isn't pictured here is Hideki Tojo in Japan. Japan did have an emperor, Emperor Hirohito, but at the time, the military was starting to gain a lot of power. A nationalistic state was starting to take hold within Japan, and just like all of the other totalitarian states here, we're looking to expand, to industrialize, to become a major power. And so the military throws not a complete coup, because they don't eliminate eliminate the emperor, but Hideki Tojo becomes prime minister, and he'll become prime minister in the middle of the war in 1941. And so essentially Emperor Hirohito just becomes a figurehead. All the decision making will take place from Hideki Tojo. Now, while the emperors are not the emperors, the dictators are starting to take power in Europe. Meanwhile, in the United States, the same year that Hitler came to power is the same year that Franklin Roosevelt was elected to the United States. So our government disapproved of the dictators because, of course, we are a promoter of democracy. However, we were not in a state or situation where we could help a lot of these young democratic nations, help them through those rough years. So we saw those democratic governments failing, but really there wasn't much we could do to try to help them. We wanted to kind of stay out of the situation of Europe. Our isolationist policies that we had implemented in the 1920s were something that we wanted to avoid. And because of our own economic crisis with the Great Depression, we feared totalitarianism. I mean, many people started to flee to Russia or the Soviet Union during the Great Depression because at least there were job opportunities there. And they thought maybe this is the way. These countries are recovering much faster than the United States when it came to the economic recession. So we wanted to try to stay out of Europe and not talk about Europe as much as possible to keep that totalitarian regime from coming to the United States. So to prevent debt dodging from nations, we are going to create the Johnson Debt Default Act. We're going to stop our lending to other countries just because we want to ensure that countries are going to be able to pay us back. Also, as a means to support our isolationist policies, we create immediately the Neutrality Acts of 35, 36, and 37. These acts were trying to fix what many of our congressmen felt were the reasons that brought us into World War I. So no American could sail, sell, or transport any type of ammunition, weaponry, not even a single bullet, or make loans to ships or nations that were argumentative with the United States or were potentially at war. We are going to try to stay out of those conflicts because, of course, we felt that was one of the leading causes that brought us into the war. Another policy or amendment that's going to be made to the Neutrality Acts is our cash and carry policy. So if we did sell you munitions or we sold you non-military items, you had to pay cash. We were not going to let you pay over time. You had to pay everything up front, and you had to take them home on your own ship. Okay, because we did not want to put our ships at risk, potentially, of course, with unrestricted submarine warfare. So you pay cash, you carry your own items, and we're happy to do business with you. So these were all attempts to keep us isolated out of the growing tense situation of Europe. So now we're going to take a look at some of those early acts of aggression by these totalitarian regimes as they start to, quote, build their empires. So as I said before, Hitler is going to be elected Chancellor of Germany. He promised to save them from the Depression. And in 1933, this is when there's going to be the formal recognition of the Soviet Union by Germany, by Italy. Hitler and Japan start to discuss growth of territory and expansion. Hitler is going to look to expand in Europe to, again, take back those German-speaking lands and people under the new German government. Japan is starting to look to expand out in mainland Asia, so Korea and parts of China at this time, and as we'll see as well, Manchuria in 1937. In 1935, Italy is going to start to expand as well. Once these totalitarian regimes had pretty much stabilized the country at home, they start looking abroad. And so since Hitler was looking to expand in Europe, Mussolini wanted to avoid conflict. So he looked to Africa. And as we know from the Berlin Conference, most of Africa had already been divided up. But one country that had remained from out of colonial rule was Ethiopia. So Mussolini wanted to build an empire. He wanted to build an empire, as he said, as grand as the Roman Empire, so to bring back the glory of Rome. He even used the same symbol that Julius Caesar had used for his legions to represent the growing European empire. And so he is going to take over Ethiopia in 1935. Hitler creates compulsory, so forced military service. He is going to break the Treaty of Versailles by creating a new air force and a new mechanized ground division. So it created jobs. This is how Germany is going to start to thrive in 1935 after Hitler comes to power, by, as we saw before, rise of militarism. He's going to build ammunition. He's going to build up an army. He's going to build up an air force, build up their navy, and everyone's got a job because everyone's got to pitch in to manufacture all the things needed for this new great army. But this does go directly against the Treaty of Versailles, and so this is where the League of Nations should have stepped in. But unfortunately, the weakness of the League of Nations and the struggles that Great Britain and France were having themselves, they saw that they could not do anything. And honestly, they felt that, the Treaty of Versailles maybe had been too harsh. So they overlook the building of the German military. Also during this time, Hitler is going to start his mass propaganda campaign throughout Germany to build the support, to gain the trust of the German people. He creates a scapegoat. He gives someone for the German people to blame for their economic problems. Of course, they blame the former Weimar Republic, but he also, for his Aryan race, starts to attack his inferior races. So Jews, Slavs, and non-white citizens. And they're going to be the key behind his propaganda campaigns. And so this is how he starts to change the perception of German people towards those, quote, inferior races in Germany. He also begins to expand himself, and one of the first territories that he does expand into is Austria, okay, in 1938. And eventually Austria will become part of Germany. And so just looking at the map here, Germany there in the center, and where they start to expand, Austria first, and then we'll talk about the Sudetenland and northern Czechoslovakia, and eventually Poland, which will ultimately start the war. 1937, Japan invades Chinese Manchuria. They were starting to invade the eastern coast of China as well. Japan is a very small set of islands with a very large population. They were looking to industrialize, but to become an industrial power, they needed access to more resources. They also needed access to more land for their growing population. So they wanted to spread out into mainland Asia. Of course, this is going to be protested in the League of Nations. Japan just walks out, and this proved the ultimate weakness of the League of Nations. The fact that a country who they were trying to sanction or trying to control just simply walked out. It's like, no, I'm not going to listen to you, and leaves. What are you going to do about it? And as we know, the League of Nations is not able to do anything about it. Franklin Roosevelt does try to take some action. So this kind of goes against the isolationist grain for the United States. He creates his quarantine speech. So he talks about how he is upset with how Japan has dealt with the issue of Manchuria and how Japan just abandoned the League of Nations. So in turn, the United States establishes embargoes where essentially we stop selling products to Japan. One item in particular is oil, which if Japan is trying to build an empire and they're trying to build up their military and they're trying to expand, oil is an essential item. And so this is going to anger Japan, and this is what, this plants the seed to eventually lead to the situation of Pearl Harbor. And so looking here, a map of Asia, you see Japan there in Tokyo. So they were starting to expand over. So you can see Manchuria, they're kind of directly across. They had already annexed Korea. And so from Manchuria, they start to move south into Peking and Nanking as they start to take over parts of eastern China. And this is where the Chinese Exclusion Act from 1882 is actually lifted, because so many Chinese were being injured or killed or tortured by the Japanese. Many were seeking refuge in the United States. So we do see an influx of Chinese immigrants to the U.S. During the Japanese aggression in China. So in early 1939, Hitler continues his area of expansion. He had already taken over Saar, which is a small country, in 1935. He'd also now taken over Austria-Hungary, Austria in 1938. Those were all willing territories. They willingly joined Germany. The first time that Hitler actually kind of hits a roadblock in his expansion is with the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia. The Sudetenland was a primarily German-speaking portion of Czechoslovakia. It had once been part of the German Empire. Hitler accused Czechoslovakia and the Czechoslovakian government of not allowing the German-speaking people to speak German in their country. They were expecting them to speak Slavic language. And he also said that they were not allowed to practice their culture. Czechoslovakia denied that any of this was true. So this led to the Munich Conference, where Hitler sat down with representation from Czechoslovakia, but also from France and Great Britain, who is going to be kind of the main speaker with Hitler, which is Neville Chamberlain. They agree to allow Hitler to take control of the Sudetenland. Hitler promises this is his last territory. He says these are German-speaking people. They want to be part of our German Empire. He says that's all I'm looking to accomplish. So I am done my area of expansion with Sudetenland. And he assigns an agreement with Great Britain's Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain. Chamberlain comes back to Great Britain kind of celebrating. He says, you know what? We've gotten peace for our time. Hitler's promised. Everything is okay. But many people saw behind Hitler's motive. It says he's not going to stop. Why would he stop? He's already taken 2 other territories. He's already built up a massive military. He's got the backing of the people. He's not going to stop, because who can stop him? Nobody can. So many people start to criticize Chamberlain's peace, particularly in the United States, and they start to call it appeasement. It wasn't a compromise. They gave in to Hitler's demands because Great Britain and France were not ready to go to war. In August of 1939, this is a huge shock to the former Allied powers, particularly France, Great Britain, and even the United States. The Soviet Union and Germany are going to sign a non-aggression pact. It's not an alliance, but it is an agreement that they will not fight one another. The next target on Hitler's list of expansion was Poland. The problem that Hitler ran into, though, is the land that made up the country of Poland was not just former German land. Part of it was also former Russian land. And so he did not want to provoke the Soviet Union into a war because, of course, at this point, Stalin had built the second largest industrial power of the world, and Hitler did not want to take that on. So instead, he offers the Soviet Union a non-aggression pact. Now, this shocks everybody because of the fact that Hitler was very vocal that he hated communism, despised it. I mean, those are, communist members are going to be some of the first people that he sends to concentration camps. But he was looking at the bigger picture. This would keep the Soviet Union from attacking his military and give him the green light to Poland. For Stalin never trusted Hitler, but he also did not trust the Western powers. He did not trust Great Britain or France. So Stalin saw this as an opportunity to buy him time. While he was an industrial power, he did not have the military strength. Because of the Great Purge, Stalin had actually gotten rid of a lot of his Red Army leadership because he feared that they may try to overthrow him in power. So he needed time to build up his military to keep Germany from invading the Soviet Union. So that's why he agrees to the non-aggression pact. And so this gets Great Britain and France kind of on red alert, like, wait a minute, why would they create a pact? Also, at this point, Hitler had already broken his promise from the Munich Conference. He had taken all of Czechoslovakia by mid-1939, and so this gave him the green light to invade Poland, which ultimately is going to begin World War I.